Hello, my name is Joe Claypatch, and I'm going to discuss a moral assessment of nuclear deterrence. We'll start out by defining some terms, make sure we're all on the same page, and then we'll talk about three different viewpoints. One is by a gentleman named Richard B. Miller. He's a professor of ethics and religion at the University of Chicago School of Divinity. He'll provide the general moral Christian perspective. Richard Wasserstrom, he's a philosophy professor at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and from him we'll get a secular ethical kind of perspective. Finally, we'll talk about a gentleman named Sir Michael Quinlan. Sir Michael Quinlan was a British civil servant who worked in the Ministry of Defense for over 30 years in the area specifically of nuclear weapons policy, and he's going to provide that position of expertise. He's also a devout Catholic, and that factors into his discussions. I'll then provide some personal assessment and some conclusions. To, to start out, I'd like to point out that I'm a naval officer in the United States military. I work in an organization called the United States Strategic Command, and we are the people who are in charge of the command and control of nuclear weapons for the United States. So I'm intimately familiar with this topic. What this is not an official U.S. military position, nor is it a position of U.S. Strategic Command. It's just a personal evaluation of the matter from my perspective. So starting out by defining those terms, the first ones we want to talk about is jus ad bellum and jus in bello. There's basic 7 principles that define morality leading up to war and in war. The first is just cause. There has to be some kind of real danger associated to go to use force. Competent authority must declare that the use of force is needed to protect the people they have an obligation to protect. Comparative justice, that requires that the values at risk are important enough to justify force. Right intention, it must be done to meet the just cause at hand. Last resort, we have to try all other means before war to resolve the conflict. Probability of success, the outcome should not be futile, and then it should be proportional and discriminate, which means inflicted damage should be proportional to the good attained, and it should not spread outside the conflict. Now, this also covers the spiritual dimension, as the Catholic bishops spoke of in their document that they published in May of 1983 called The Challenge of Peace, which was about nuclear warfare, in which they said, quote, "Nor should judgments concerning proportionality be limited to the temporal order without regard to the spiritual dimension." What is deterrence? Deterrence is just the maintenance of a nuclear arsenal with the aim of preventing another nuclear armed country from using nuclear weapons in war against yourself or your allies. Looking at Richard Miller's arguments, what he does is he critiques 4 different theories that are used typically to justify nuclear deterrence. The first one is the success theory. Basically, this theory says that there's been no nuclear war since the start of nuclear weapons, other than that which was used during World War II. So therefore, nuclear deterrence is morally acceptable. But the problem with that is it doesn't mean just because A comes after B, doesn't mean that B is the cause of A. Maybe there was no reason or desire to go down the path of aggression between 2 adversaries. The next topic he talks about is those who justify nuclear deterrence based on just war theory. And this is based on the moral thought that nuclear war does not fit jus in bello requirements of proportionality and discrimination. Therefore, deterrence is needed to prevent nuclear war from happening. The fault Richard Miller points out here is that deterrence requires the plan to use nuclear war and therefore violates the jus in bello principles. The next argument he talks about is the argument from supreme emergency. Supreme emergency claims that we can't use just war theory to evaluate nuclear deterrence because nuclear war cannot meet the requirement of jus in bello. So basically we have to throw out that morality and change to an ends justify the means view of morality. Basically the choice in nuclear war from that perspective is to fight criminally or cease to exist. But the flaw here is if we can eclipse morality to justify the deterrence, then why can't we eclipse morality to justify the use of nuclear weapons? It's kind of a very relativistic moral philosophy. Finally, he talks about and discusses the exceptionalist thesis. Basically, this one says that nuclear deterrence is acceptable because it prevents an adversary from conducting nuclear war and therefore allows my virtuous society to flourish and not be engulfed by the adversary's morally corrupt regime. But this is a hypocritical view that if the bad regime carry out an act, it's bad, but if I carry out the act, it's good. It also places the nation state and not humanity as a whole as the ideal to be preserved. Some thoughts on Miller's arguments. I think he provides valid critiques of the different justifications. What he doesn't do, though, is he doesn't establish evidence for his stated conclusion that nuclear deterrence is irrational. And what we do learn from here, too, is that many arguments for nuclear deterrence are grounded in either proportionalism, consequentialism, or relativism. Moving on to Richard Wasserstrom, we see that his position is that no theory defending the present practices of nuclear deterrence can make genuinely plausible and defensible the maintenance or pursuit of a state of affairs possessing these kinds of inherently morally disastrous components. Basically, he has four premises at which he determines that nuclear deterrence is wrong. Nuclear weapons have extreme destructive power and they are maintained in massive quantities. That is true. Effects of nuclear war will extend far beyond boundaries of the countries in battle. That also is true. He says a nuclear war would not be a prolonged, drawn-out conflict. It would happen really fast, and there'd be no opportunity for heroism or virtue, and there'd be no opportunity to recognize any flaws or mistakes we're making and turn around. I'm not sure I agree with this is true based on my understanding of how nuclear war would work from my kind of experience perspective there. He also says that nuclear war is run by single-digit commanders, and it's not a war of the populace. I also disagree with this. We have a popularly elected president. The military supports the president on behalf of the American people. It's very much a populist act, any kind of war that America goes to, even if there are people who disagree with it. But he uses these things to define nuclear war, and deterrence is always wrong. In that the problem of defense is killing non-combatants and also the increase of massive amount of fatalities that would happen in the event of nuclear war. He also points out that if nuclear deterrence fails, you have to use nuclear weapons to reestablish that deterrence. Finally, he has an intriguing kind of point where he says that nuclear deterrence leads us down a path of inflexible response with regards to the adversary's action. Some comments on Wasserstrom's position. He says nuclear weapons are bad, which I agree with. They are hard topics to deal with. Points of disagreement. I think he has some flawed premise that I talked about. Regarding that inflexibility of response he talks about, I think that's inherently avoided in the structure of our military and the political hierarchy because it basically changes every 3 or 4 years. It prevents that stagnation and it provides new insight all the time. And like Mr. Miller, he never provides a suggested solution or justifies his position where nuclear war is not morally acceptable. Sir Michael Quinlan, he starts his argument by establishing a paradigm for the discussion of number one, weapons are new and extremely powerful. And number two, the cause of war go all the way back to human history. And this is what he said is the primary thing that needs to be fixed. It's a problem that we have to account for, though, because of the broken aspect of human nature. It's a very kind of Catholic perspective here. And since this is the fact, then we really only have two options. We either need nuclear deterrence or we need to renounce nuclear weapons. And he actually says that even though he's in favor of deterrence, he says that renunciation is the favorable of the two options. But he says, and I quote, consequences abound and they affect the moral quality of an act. And this starts to sound kind of like a proportionalistic perspective. But he says in the meantime, while we can't go to renunciation, he sees deterrence is the only option. To evaluate the moral evaluation of deterrence, he has two questions that he says need to be asked. The first one, are consequences better with or without nuclear deterrence? This is kind of a hat tip to proportionalism here. His second question, is the nature of nuclear deterrence an intrinsic moral evil? Regarding question one, the consequences, he highlights some benefits. He talks about the increased communications on both sides. He talks about how neither superpower could disarm the other because nuclear technology has advances to the point where we couldn't disarm each other, therefore lowering the risk of deterrence failure. And then also huge arsenals are maintained which compel great caution, also lowering the risk of deterrence failure. He says even if these benefits exist, though, we have to ask is possession of these weapons intrinsically evil because ends don't justify intrinsically evil means. So he's kind of going against proportionalism here by recognizing that there is intrinsical aspects to evil. Which leads to question 2, is possession of deterrence intrinsically evil? He states up front that possession would be evil if use of nuclear weapons was evil in all cases. He doesn't have this conflict between use and deterrence that a lot of people have. But he deviates from others, and he says there are some cases in which nuclear weapons could be justified in use. Attacks on population centers for the sake of attacking population centers, he points out, is immoral. But he also points out that during World War II, 50 million people lost their lives, and we call that a just war because the alternative submission to a dictator like Hitler fit the jus ad bella requirements of just cause, comparative justice, and right intentions. So he says that limited use of nuclear weapons is okay, therefore deterrence can be acceptable. My evaluation of him, I think if there's a failure in that, he uses consequentialism to justify whether something is intrinsically evil or not. So while he gives a leaning towards intrinsic evil, he uses proportionalistic and consequentialist aspects to define that. My personal assessment on this whole topic, I think there's reason for hope. The Cold War ended. We showed that we can turn away from the brink of human annihilation, and we now have enhanced communication between adversaries. I think reliance on deterrence precludes or may preclude active love. By relying on deterrence for peace, adversaries neglect the responsibility to answer Jesus' call to love of neighbor. We kind of sit on our laurels there. Also, it affects human dignity. Deterrence requires demonstration of the ability to carry out nuclear capabilities, exercising, practicing, planning. What does this practicing and planning do to the inherent recognition of human dignity? When one practices and speaks of mass fatalities of nuclear war, does it somehow harden our hearts as nuclear operators to our fellow man? Some essential ends that I think need to be focused on when it comes to nuclear deterrence. We have to focus on the enhanced love between humanity, and we have to act with an end of disarmament in mind. John Paul II points this out in his message to the UN Special Session in 1982, in which he said, I quote, "In current conditions, deterrence based on balance, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward a progressive disarmament, may still be judged morally acceptable." Something that's lacking from the calculation here is effects on proliferation. We as the United States have said that we will protect our allies. If, say, a country like North Korea attacks Japan with a nuclear weapon, do we respond? If we don't respond, will countries like Japan, Australia, countries that rely on us for that support of nuclear deterrence, will they start establishing their own nuclear programs? Some essential responses. I think ultimately, as far as essential response is concerned, is it's at the level of the individual acting person. The individual person needs to ensure that we don't let deterrence result as a dissolution of the concept of human dignity. We need to ensure that when interacting with planners, human dignity is always brought to the floor. When I'm advising senior decision makers, I need to take the advantage of the opportunity to bring love of neighbor into the situation. We need to ensure deterrence is used as a springboard to disarmament. Ultimately, I think deterrence really is just morally neutral. I think it's our actions are what define morality. If deterrence is used for maintaining and establishing peace, it's morally acceptable. If deterrence is used as a vehicle for enhancing human dignity, that action of enhancing human dignity is morally acceptable. So ultimately, I think the conclusion here is that nuclear deterrence is morally neutral, and it's our actions that define the morality of the situation.